Good evening, everyone. So on behalf of the Sheikh Abdullah Salam Cultural Center, hope you're all having a wonderful Ramadan, staying with family and being safe. So because it's Ramadan, we had to make a workshop about the science of fasting since everyone has some kind of idea that fasting is good for health, right? So after this workshop, you'll find that fasting should be a part of your life in some way, shape, or form, especially if you're suffering from some sort of condition, maybe mentioned in this presentation, right? So, but before we get started, let me share my screen and I'll explain to you what you'll be seeing. Hold on 1 minute. All right, so does everyone see the screen? Everyone's good on that, right? Type in the chat or give me a thumbs up if you see the screen. Cool, great. All right, so let me give you some background first before we get started on the people in this picture, right? Obviously, you see that around three of them in this picture are of shorter stature, never mind the child, right? They are a part of a small population in Loja, Ecuador. And they have a unique type of dwarfism that we'll be discussing later. So this kind of dwarfism, it's one that gives us insight into the power of fasting. So I won't spoil it just yet, but just sit tight and we'll get to it. And also something I'd like to kind of drive home to you guys is that I am not, this is not medical advice. The content in this presentation is not medical advice. All content is for educational purposes. I am not a medical doctor. I'm just a guy that likes science and I'm good at science, and here I am, and that's what I do. So anyway, strap yourselves in. So the human race has always been aware of some medical benefit to fasting for some time, right? I mean, all of us know that Ramadan is good for us, right? But why? As back as, I think, 2,400 years ago, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, he said, "To eat when you are sick is to feed your illness." So Hippocrates, back in the day, he saw that people with epilepsy had reduced severity of seizures whenever they fasted. So people, that had epilepsy, they had, anytime they abstained from food, their symptoms would get better, and they were better off. They had less frequency of epilepsy, or less frequency of their seizures, and then when they did have their seizures, it wasn't as basically severe. And in fact, in the Navy, the U.S. Navy is studying fasting and the ketogenic diet for controlling seizures in their divers, in their Navy SEAL divers. So we'll get back to that in a bit. Also, here's a statue of an emaciated Buddha. So Buddhists practice something called asceticism. And asceticism is basically severe self-discipline where you avoid all forms of indulgence for religious reasons, right? The Buddha also recognized that fasting had health benefits, and he's quoted as saying, "Not eating a meal in the evening, you'll be aware of good health." So he was speaking to his monks here when he said this, when this is recorded. And so for quite some time, we've been aware that fasting has health benefits, right? Even if you might not know the molecular biology or the science behind it, you do know that, I mean, intuitively, right? It's intuitive. I mean, growing up, I know that, my father always told me that fasting was good for you. I had no idea why. And he didn't know, he didn't really have a clear scientific understanding of why. But some of us intuitively know it is. So in fact, many religions require fasting for not only a spiritual practice, but for overall health as well, right? So you can see many examples of fasting in virtually every religion around the world throughout history. So it should make sense to us that in this so-called age of reason and scientific advancement, we investigate the actual biology behind fasting. Anyway, fun fact on this last picture to the right, that is the Temple of Fire in Shiraz, I think. It's in Iran. It's for Zoroastrianism. I think that's what it is. Yeah. Anyway, so in 1911, the famous writer Upton Sinclair found that fasting cured his indigestion problems. So he frequently went to fasting clinics and recorded testimonies of how many people that rid themselves of their arthritis or their skin issues or their liver issues, migraines, and even anxiety by just fasting. He found this. And so in 1911, he wrote The Fasting Cure. And so it didn't have anything in the way of scientific information about why people's health improved with fasting, but it did a great job of raising awareness as to the power of fasting. So when did we start getting really scientific as a human race? When did we start getting really scientific about this? Oh, you have gray squares on my screen. Oh, gray squares. The screen is not clear. That's strange. Maybe it's because we're doing a live video. Sorry, guys, for the technical difficulties. Let me unshare my screen and then I'll share it again. It's quite strange. All right, let's see. Now, how's that? Perfect? Great. Okay. So, yes, as I was saying, Upton Sinclair, famous writer, documented his own benefit, I guess, his own experience with fasting, and then took note of many testimonies of fasting to treat various conditions. And there wasn't really a scientific understanding of what fasting did, but people had the general idea that it did something good. So it wasn't until Otto Buchinger, a German army physician, opened a clinic and started to research fasting as a curative therapy. So he actually cured his rheumatism, his pain in the joints, which was chronic, by just fasting. He stopped eating for 7 days and he found that his rheumatism was gone. So that's what inspired him to open the clinic. And even now in modern times, there's the Buchinger Clinic, which is still open, where you can pay a bunch of money to go on a fasting retreat where they take care of you. It's in Germany. So in today, we have many scientists all over the world studying different aspects of fasting. And the most famous is Dr. Walter Longo from Italy. I believe he's working at USC in California. So he's made significant contributions to our understanding of fasting. He's the researcher behind, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it. We'll explain it later in the presentation, but he's the researcher behind the fasting mimicking diet, which is namely used in people with cancer. So before we get, I keep saying this, before we get to this, before we get to that, but before we get into the biology of why fasting is good for us, I want you guys to keep something in mind. And that is how we treat patients today, right? If you have high blood pressure, what do? You take high blood pressure medication, right? If you have type 2 diabetes, you simply take insulin, right? In both of those examples, high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes, all you're really doing is fixing an upstream issue. You're not getting to the root of the problem. And so the case that I'm presenting to you all today is that fasting, in my opinion, might be a better long-term strategy than the current band-aid solution to many diseases. And as I've said, I'm not a medical practitioner, but also we'll go over some studies that might reflect that, right? So what you're looking at now are different organisms that have an obvious size difference, right? On the left, we have yeast. In the middle, we have fruit flies. And on the right, we have mice, little cute mice. So it turns out the genes and proteins that help us get bigger in size actually also contribute to aging and earlier death. So each smaller organism in this series of pictures lives longer than their larger counterpart. So the smaller organisms are what we call mutants. They have mutations in genes responsible for growth. And it turns out they live longer. So scientists know that those genes, nutrients activate these growth genes. So nutrients like carbohydrates and proteins, and in some cases fat. So if there's food, an organism will grow. Turns out if you restrict food or you starve an organism, it lives longer, right? You can see here the graphs below, A, B, and C, and D. Shows there's a graph that says bacteria, yeast, worm, and mice. You'll see that in the organism, there are basically two populations of bacteria, two populations of yeast, two populations of worms and mice, right? Or three populations in the case of worms. Basically, the less food that each organism receives, the longer the lifespan. You'll see on the y-axis it says survival rate, and then on the x it says hours, so or days or weeks in the case of mice. So basically, each organism, down to bacteria, up to mice, seem to live longer, and in fact are healthier compared to organisms that are basically fed ad libitum, meaning like whenever they want to eat. And in the case of bacteria, they're just exposed to food. Zainab asked, is it linked to glycation? And not quite. We'll get to that. Glycation is it's a bit of past the, I guess, the sight or the oversight, or is it the oversight? Past the scope of this presentation, but we'll talk about it at the end. I'll go back to that, Zainab. So this is kind of counterintuitive, right? How is it that virtually all organisms we restrict food from live longer? So you'd think that the more food they'd have, the longer they would survive and thrive, right? It might be crazy to think this, but organisms down to simple yeast to complex humans have evolved to deal with food scarcity. So take penguins, right? For example, penguins, they can live up to 5 months without food. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that. Even in the harsh Arctic conditions, penguins can live up to 5 months. How is that? So how long can we go for without food? And how do we answer that such a question, right? Well, humans can live probably around 60 days or 2 months without food. And while mice can only really survive for around 4 days without food. So if you're fasting more than 24 hours, you lose around 2% of your body weight as a human. You lose around 2% of your body weight per day. But if you're a mouse, you're losing 20% of your body weight per day. So it's not great to be fasting as a mouse. So how do we know that it's 60 days? Well, it actually has a really nasty kind of historical, I guess, story. And it is, we know that from hunger strikes, from political prisoners and stuff. So here's a question for you guys. How does the body meet energy requirements to stay alive when it is starving or fasting? How can it do that? And yes, the cat is a hint. So type in the chat if you think you know. Resting. Ooh, Inji, resting. Not quite. Not quite. I mean, you'd think that if you're resting, then you'd be doing better while you're fasting, but actually that's not the case. It's kind of counterintuitive. It's actually better to exercise while you're fasting or starving to signal the preservation of your muscle. So it's not resting, but the hint, there's a burning fat. Thank you, Bezer. Yes, fat. So the cat was a lovely hint. That is a very fat cat. And if you don't think that's a fat cat, go ask the street cats outside. That's a very fat cat. So fat, yes. Think of your body as, so think of fat actually as less of a hindrance to looking how you want to look, right? And more like bags of energy. So fat is very chemically stable and can be in our bodies for a very long time. So which is why we use it, right? That, and it's also energetically very rich. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the ketogenic diet, which involves eating mostly fat. I'm sure, and also a little protein. Your body goes into a state of ketosis when you're on the ketogenic diet or when you're fasting or starving instead of glucose. So your body will burn ketone bodies instead of glucose, which come from fat. So you can see here in the diagram, triglycerides right here, and they're kind of ugly and yellow. They're like little ugly yellow bubbles. Those triacylglycerols, are basically the fat from your fat cells, convert to ketone bodies or metabolic fuels, which then power your organs, such as the brain, kidneys, and the muscles. So that explains how we're able to survive in food scarce conditions, and it basically underlies the fasting process. There's a lot that's going on besides just the burning of energy. In fact, when you're in a state of ketosis, it turns out that the chemicals that are broken, the chemicals that come from the breakdown of fat, actually also signal your brain to grow, which we'll get to in a bit. So we will get to the cool science, I swear. I apologize for the long background information, but it's important to delineate what we mean by fasting, right? You can categorize many strategies of fasting into two categories, prolonged fasting and intermittent fasting. So prolonged fasts are typically longer than 2 days and include the fasting mimicking diet and straight 48-hour plus fasts. So where you're only having water in those 48-hour plus fasts. Usually those are medically supervised. So intermittent fasting, though, has a lot of other, a lot of different approaches as opposed to prolonged fasting, where it's basically just, hey, you just not eat for 48 hours. In both types of fasting, though, you're doing essentially the same thing, but to different degrees, right? you're activating what we call a molecular starvation or fasting response, where the body makes tons of energy, or sorry, tons of changes to itself because it does not sense incoming nutrients. So we'll talk, as I said, more about the fasting mimicking diet later when we discuss cancer and which method might be the best for health outcomes. So I'm sure that a lot of you guys have heard about 16-8 or 18-6 or 24 or 5-2. Basically, those are a lot of the intermittent fasting protocols touted on social media for quick weight loss or something. And turns out they are great for weight loss because they do change fundamentally how the brain reacts to food and how the body reacts to food. So now that we have that out of the way, prolonged fasting and intermittent fasting, we won't get into the details about what each one, how it affects your physiology per se, but basically what I want you guys to take away from this is that there is an activation of a molecular starvation or fasting response. So it's very unnatural for humans to eat 3 or more meals a day with snacking in between. That is a very modern conception. Our ancestors were highly adapted to hunting and gathering food, which meant a frequent period in which they didn't have any food, right? Before the agricultural age. So if you couldn't find food, you'd need to be a little bit extra mentally alert, right? And active to find your next meal. So who of you notice that you become a little bit more alert during the day when you're fasting? So tell me in the chat if you think you become a little bit more alert when you've had less food. So for me, I get, super alert when I'm fasting, especially in the morning or whatever. I get most of my work done actually in a fasted state, than in a fed state. In a fed state, I'm quite vegetative. I don't want to work. So let me know in the chat if you guys feel the same way. So something to think about. True, yeah. Super alert, then sleepy after food. Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So, but the health applications of that go, just way beyond work, in my case at least. So there's something called the Morris water maze test, that scientists use to assess cognitive functions in mice. Basically, you have a pool of water, right, with a see-through or invisible platform in one section of the water that the mouse can't see. Actually, let me just draw it really quick on the thing. So let's say you have your tub of water, right? You have here's the water. And then you have a little platform, and it's a see-through kind of platform that the mouse can't see. The experiment involves, it's kind of, some people might say it's cruel, but hey, we got to do this, right? It involves putting a mouse in the water, and they have to basically find the platform to rest on, right? Once they swim around enough in the same pool for enough times, they learn where the platform is, even though it's invisible, right? And they start gravitating to that section of the pool, and they'll start finding their way to the platform much quicker. So anyway, Morris water maze test. Basically, you have the pool of water and you put the mice in repeatedly and see how quickly they can find their platform. So as I said, it's a great assessment actually for cognitive function. It does two things. It tells you how much those mice have learned after repeated sessions. And then number two, it tells you it could be a proxy of what their brain function is like. So in this experiment, the young mice found the platform very easily and stayed only in two sections of the water tub before finding the platform. You can see these purple squiggly lines on this diagram show that the young mice, they tend to stay in these two quadrants right here at the top. And here, there's a little platform right there. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's in each of these images as well. Here and here. That's the platform. So the young mice tended to find the platform much quicker and stay in two quadrants. Whereas the older mice that were fed, that had free access to food, they tended to go all over the place. They weren't that great at learning where the platform was. They were all over the place. But when you restricted the food of those older mice, their behavior tended to reflect that of the younger mice. They had less food. That's the only difference. And so what does that say, right? What do you guys think it says? Type in the chat if you guys have an idea of what that says. Maybe a difficult question, but okay. Well, I guess hunger is motivating. Yeah, good. So that's good. but it's not quite what I was getting at. So how could fasted animals perform better at cognitive tasks? So I just asked you that, right? Turns out when we put animals on a fasting protocol, the levels of a protein called BDNF increase. What is BDNF? So BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And if you know anything about gardening, which I'm sure a lot of you know everything about gardening, it's the brain's Miracle-Gro. So Miracle-Gro, if you're not familiar with it, it is basically great for plants it's basically plant nutrient, right? So this is a protein that stimulates brain growth. So we'll get into the specifics now. So the good news is that even in humans, if you put them on a fasting protocol, the levels of BDNF increase. So it's not just in mice, it's also in humans. So here's a graph showing people not on a fasting protocol, so the control group, and people on a fasted protocol, the ETRF group. These are people on a fasting protocol. And this group of people ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. And they found that in the morning and even at night, there were significant differences in the levels of BDNF, this brain Miracle-Gro, in their blood between the control group, right? So what does that say? So the graph, obviously, as I said, is telling us that the people that were fasted had much higher BDNF. So this is one of my favorite proteins of the body because of what it does. So why would we even want higher BDNF in the blood? What is that? What is the significance of that? Let's get to it. So BDNF actually does a whole lot. It regulates appetite somewhat, not as much as other hormones. And I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have ever seen these ads in Kuwait, but there's a restaurant called Grelin. It's Grelin. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but actually it's a very smart name because it's the hunger hormone. But anyway, Grelin is the main hunger hormone, but BDNF turns out also regulates appetite. It's also thought to be behind increased activity levels. So because it can be found in high concentrations in the motor cortex of fasted animals, or basically like the area of the brain responsible for movement, it's actually found in very high levels there when you starve animals. And so that might be why we also feel more alert, right? Or I guess more active, fasted. We feel less heavy, right? Less lethargic. But here's the more exciting thing. BDNF stimulates the production of new neurons in the brain. So neurons are brain cells that help us with everything, and were once thought to be a fixed number for the rest of your life, basically. Turns out that isn't true. Your brain is constantly making new neurons, even into old age. So also BDNF signals our brain to create new connections as well, new connections between brain cells. Remember the mice in the swim test, right? Where they had to learn where a platform was in a pool of water. The fasted mice might have done better because of the action of BDNF enhancing learning. And in fact, there's a lot of drugs out there that stimulate the production of BDNF that have been shown to enhance learning. And they are accessible to us. So BDNF enhances learning and memory. BDNF also makes the brain more resilient to injury. So this is kind of a boring one, but basically cellular injury. Let's say you get hit in the head, right? You have very high levels of BDNF. Chances are you have less damage to your brain cells if you have a very high level of BDNF than if you didn't. So, and also in mice biologically engineered to develop Alzheimer's disease, BDNF can actually save their memory degradation or slow it, or slow the onset of Alzheimer's. So with how the human race is doing now, especially in this day and age with neurodegenerative diseases, that's very important to know. I mean, yes, it protects against neurodegenerative diseases in mice. What about humans? The answer is we don't know yet. So fasting increases BDNF. That's the takeaway. But has anyone ever heard of autophagy? This is kind of a buzzword on social media. It's all over the place, and it's used in kind of very inappropriate ways, but we'll get to the science of it. The picture is very self-explanatory though. So autophagy refers to how each of your cells does housekeeping. So just like you would clean your room or your house, you throw away or reuse old things that you don't need anymore, right? So same thing with autophagy in your cells. So just by existing, your cells are producing tons of waste. Even now, as I'm speaking, your cells and my cells are producing tons and tons of waste all the time. And in fact, that's one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, where there's tons of waste build up in the brain and it's not cleared properly. So you can see in this image to the left, there's actually the quote unquote Alzheimer's protein called amyloid beta in blue. So that is the protein thought to cause Alzheimer's in blue, even though it's not fully proven, I guess, yet. That is the garbage or the waste produced by our cells that builds up and leads to the pathogenesis or the generation of Alzheimer's. So autophagy is extremely important because it clears a lot of that waste inside the cell and outside the cell. And so fasting activates autophagy or the self-eating mechanism, right? And it may be another reason why we see improvements of various conditions, not just Alzheimer's. So here's a cool diagram of autophagy. Basically, the cell surrounds old or damaged cellular components and degrades them. That kind of cellular housekeeping is occurring all the time. It's not just when you're fasting, it's happening all the time. But the thing is, it's happening a lot, I guess, a lot more when you're fasting. And one of the buzzwords of the topics in the fitness community on Instagram and social media and stuff is how much of this is occurring. And they always say that, oh yeah, 72 hours is when autophagy occurs. The truth is, not many people know, and it's really hard to quantify. But safe to say that fasting, we know it does increase autophagy. We just don't know how much and what it exactly translates to in terms of health outcomes. But we do know that it has important implications for Alzheimer's and other diseases. So you can categorize what kind of state your body is in depending on how fed you are. So you and your cells, probably after futur and all that stuff, they're in a growth mode when there's basically plenty of nutrients making it into the body, right? You're making new cells and you're making those cells bigger. So bodybuilders are always trying to maintain themselves or in a growth mode, right? To build muscle and mass. They're trying to get bigger. But when you're fasted, you enter something we call conserve resources mode. I know it sounds like a very creative name, conserve resources mode, but lo and behold, that's what we have. So when you're fasted, you enter a conserve resources mode where autophagy occurs and your cells are not really dividing as rapidly. They're maintaining their population with housekeeping, cleaning their room, if you will. And so what switch is fasting activating to turn on and off that growth mode and the conserve resources mode? And actually, we'll go back to the title slide, right? With the population of dwarves, that very specific population in Loja, Ecuador. So here are the Loja dwarves, and there's only around 250 of them in the world, and they all basically reside in Loja, Ecuador. They're actually from the Mediterranean. Their lineage, their genetic lineage it shows us that they came from the Mediterranean somehow. So what about? But first, let me describe their symptoms. They're obviously very short in stature, right? But also they have very peculiar biology. They have low blood pressure throughout their life. Sorry, low blood sugar throughout their life, and they also are very, very sensitive to sugar. Very sensitive to sugar, even if they're obese. So wait, hold on, let me go back. But anyway, I just want to make the point that this condition is called Laron Syndrome. It's exceedingly rare. And so this population was studied because of its relation to that on-off switch we were talking about. It seems to be that they have a deficit in their on switch. So these people are constitutively in the off mode or the conserve resources mode. And so that's why they have short stature. Throughout their life, they didn't receive the signal to basically grow taller. All right. And also, they have very, very low cancer rates. They have some of the lowest cancer rates compared to any other population. You'll see on the left in this graph, these are their relatives unaffected by Laron syndrome, or this kind of dwarfism. But in that small 250 people population, they had a very, very low chance of cancer. And curiously, they also had a much higher rate of obesity, but a much lower rate of diabetes. Usually with obesity, what happens is that if you have obesity, you usually have diabetes. And so that's very peculiar that they don't have that. So why is that? Let me just go here. All right. So it turns out, as I said, they have a deficit in growth hormone receptor, which is basically the body's on switch or off switch for proliferation of cells, or proliferation of, or basically growth, right? So when you're in a fasted state, you have, curiously, you're putting your body in an off state where your cells are not growing. As I said, they're doing a lot of housekeeping, and that's one of the reasons why. 1 minute, hold on. Sorry, just a little technical difficulty with my computer. It's not changing the slide for some reason. That is strange. Okay, wait a minute. Sorry guys, I have to unshare my screen really quick. That's weird. Okay, let's try this again. All right. Okay, there. Okay, cool. Anyway, yeah. So in fact, we know the reason that the Loja dwarves have their condition, and it's because of this low growth hormone receptor, right? They're constitutively in an off state, right? As I said. So let me ask you guys a question. What diseases can you think of that have an overly high proliferation of cells? So I think you guys saw the slide next, but I'm still going to ask if you were, and test if you guys are paying attention. So put in the chat if you think you know. What diseases can you think of that leads to high proliferation of cells? Cancer. So many cancers have an overactive growth signal. So cancer is an unrestricted proliferation of cells that turns out very bad for us. So if we can learn from the Loja people and apply the principles of their biochemistry, their very unique biochemistry, to us, we can infer that fasting might help with cancer. And indeed it does. So in a trial of around 33 patients with pancreatic cancer, combining fasting with chemotherapy improved survival odds to 1 year. So if you know anything about pancreatic cancer, it is typically the least treatable form of cancer, with survival odds extremely low. So the fasting patients experience less negative symptoms from their chemotherapy. And I should also say that this was repeated with mice as well. And the results of that experiment demonstrate fasting and chemotherapy to be superior to either fasting alone or chemotherapy alone. So basically, I should explain how they did this trial first. They basically used a typical drug that they used on pancreatic cancer patients, and just used that one drug alone, and found that after 1 year, the group had only a 20% survival rate after 1 year. Whereas if you used a combination of anti-cancer drugs, you had a much higher rate of survival after 1 year. But if you use this combination of drugs and you were putting your patients on a fasting protocol, they survived in much higher amounts. So that is extremely profound. And the most significant thing also is not just the survival rate, but also less negative symptoms from chemotherapy, and also longer remission times. These patients that survive past 1 year, they also tended to live past that 82.5% of, I guess, those people that survived, their cancer didn't come back. And usually with pancreatic cancer, that's very rare because it's super, super aggressive. So what other conditions can fasting help? If it's helping cancer, it could be also helping Alzheimer's. What other things could it be helping? So because that's my question to you. So answer in the chat what you guys think. What other conditions can fasting help? There's a clue in the picture. Diabetes, good, good. It's related. What else? Obesity. Hey, Inji got it. Okay, perfect. All right, so because we are in an age of excessive indulgence with our food, a lot of countries have seen rises in obesity, right? And I think Kuwait is close to having, the highest number of obese people proportional to its population in the world. So obviously, with obesity comes a constellation of disease risk, right? So from diabetes to high blood pressure to stroke, which puts you at great risk for all sorts of stuff like stroke. Um, Metabolic syndrome is actually the thing or the term to describe this constellation of, I guess, risk factors, and it's perhaps, I think, the number one health threat in the developed world, the so-called developed countries, right? So, turns out, if you make obese mice, not only will they look super cute, but they'll also suffer from a variety of things similar to human metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance or diabetes, high blood pressure, central adiposity, which is basically fat around the midsection, which is also very inflammatory and bad for the body. And they'll also have increased risk of stroke, these rats that you make very fat. And the way you make them very fat is, what do? You put them on a diet high in sugar and fat. It tastes like a sweet, fatty, nasty, disgusting chow, and they love it, apparently. And they get really obese. So, what can fasting do? What happens if you put these obese mice uh, on a fasting protocol? Can you reverse all that you've done to that poor mouse? Turns out that you can reverse all symptoms of associated with metabolic syndrome. So this is fantastic. No drugs, no surgical intervention, nothing. Just dietary changes, and you can return an obese mouse to a normal weighted mouse with normal blood pressure, normal insulin resistance, less central adiposity. Um, so just good old, I guess, medically supervised fasting. So the question I'm sure you guys are all asking or wondering is, what about humans? Does this work in humans? And it turns out absolutely it does. And it's funny how this is not really covered. It's not really covered in the news that much. So I'm sorry for the assault of graphs on the screen right now, but I guess we'll explain each one. On this first one is BMI, so body mass index, and basically they took a population in this study. They took a population of normally weighted people, so these are the normally rated people. And they also took a population of obese people. So, and they wanted to see what would happen after putting these two groups of people on fasting protocols. And it turns out that, yeah, there were benefits for the normal group of people in their weight or their BMI, their blood pressure, their IGF-1, which is something related to insulin, glucose, which is basically their blood sugar, their triglycerides, so how much fat basically is in their blood. There's benefits basically across the board. And especially their cholesterol, and especially their bad cholesterol, their quote unquote bad cholesterol, LDL. So basically, though, you'll see that the obese patients experienced more positive change. They experienced more significant change. It's almost like the body wants to go back to how it normally should be, right? In the obese patients. So that's amazing. So the results look great. And also, in this study, I should say that one of the most surprising findings is that people in the obese group that had high blood pressure, so people in the obese group that had high blood pressure and high, uh, insulin and blood glucose, they actually got to a great point where they could wean off their medication. So they didn't need their medication anymore. That is phenomenal. And another thing that's still being studied from this particular, or still being interpreted from this study and being investigated, is, I guess, the what is it? The people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes were able to reverse their condition. And if you know anything about type 1 diabetes, it is that the pancreas in the body, here's the pancreas in the body doesn't have or cells to produce insulin for your body to take in sugar, because the immune system is constantly attacking the pancreas. But it turns out after putting these obese type 1 diabetes patients on a fasting protocol, it looked like their pancreas regenerated insulin producing cells. And that also, we'll talk about something at the end that is very, very surprising. I'll pull it up. So just to summarize everything right now, we've seen that fasting can help us with Alzheimer's, at least in mice, and there's some studies still being underway with humans. Fasting can help us with cancer, and fasting can help us with the #1 disease of the modern age, metabolic syndrome. That is a giant. That's huge. And it's free, as long as it's medically guided. I guess it's not really free, but it should be medically guided. All right, so, and it turns out fasting is also, and might also be good for longevity. So up until now, we've discussed diseases, right? So what about aging? So can fasting help us age just like it does in model organisms? So if you remember at the beginning of this presentation, I showed you a bunch of graphs with yeast and mice and how they live longer by fasting or by having less food access, right? So could it be the same for humans? Because we'd all like to stay on this earth for a little bit more time, right? Well, at least some of us. And the thing is, aging is still, there's a researcher in Harvard, his name is David Sinclair, and he posits that aging is not just a natural, it's not a natural thing, it's actually a disease. And he wants to classify aging as a disease. That sounds absurd, but you know what? He doesn't sound so crazy when you read into his reasoning. So it turns out it actually might. Fasting might actually extend your life. And so this is a graph from the study I linked earlier where you had two groups of people, right? People that ate all day or people that only ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. So the group that ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. every day had higher expression. Basically, this certain gene was turned on, right? Of a longevity gene, or the so-called longevity genes. There's two main longevity genes that were basically upregulated or were increased in this population of people, in these fasted people particularly. One is called SIRT1, or SIRT1. And so I'm sorry if I'm getting too sciencey, but this is very interesting stuff. So SIRT1 does many things. It's a gene that is activated by many things, but it's also seems to be activated when there's not much food out there, which is interesting. So here are your genes, here's your DNA. That's a really bad double helix. Anyway, so in yeast, we know what SIRT1 does quite well, but we're still defining what it does in humans. We know that SIRT1 reduces inflammation, which is great. It increases autophagy, which is, as we said, the housekeeping, right? The housekeeping mechanism of the cell, which is extremely important, right? So you can clear damaged cellular products from your system or your cells. And it also improves mitochondrial function. So what are mitochondria? They are the powerhouse of the cell, right? It's a meme at this point. Increase mitochondrial function. And so basically, if you increase mitochondrial function, you're basically helping your body meet energy requirements, and it is thus able to meet more strenuous energy requirements, right? Your body is not constrained by an energy deficit. And this is particularly important with Alzheimer's. So they say that there's a lot of people now that are talking about Alzheimer's as a mitochondrial dysfunction or a mitochondrial disorder, as opposed to basically a buildup of too much junk. It's basically your brain cells are not receiving enough energy to clear that waste. And so that's why Alzheimer's develops. So we still don't know exactly why Alzheimer's develops, but here's one of there's a theory out there, or there's a hypothesis rather out there. So SIRT1 is doing a lot of good things, and we'd like to see it increased. It's a very good gene to have, and that's why it's classified under a longevity gene. mTOR is a little bit different. This is one of your main nutrient sensing genes, and it's also linked to longevity. So whenever there's a high presence of carbohydrates in your system, just like high blood sugar, or whenever there's a very high presence of protein or amino acids, which are basically protein building blocks, aminos, then this gene is activated, or I think it's activated. And so, or sorry, I think it's deactivated. I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, basically, mTOR has something to do with nutrient sensing. And it activates basically certain genes to prolong your cellular health. And it does very similar things to SIRT1 in that it increases mitochondrial function, it has relations to autophagy, and it also has relation to inflammation. So very, very important. So basically, fasting is good for you, and fasting increases the expression, your body's expression of these longevity genes, which is extremely important. So not only does fasting help with diseases, but it also helps with longevity. So let's summarize first the health effects of fasting that we discussed. It seems to reverse metabolic syndrome. It helps cancer treatment, as we've seen in the pancreatic cancer patient trial. And it aids in neurodegenerative diseases. And it might increase longevity and has numerous documented health effects that we don't have time for today. It's shown to help stomach issues, autoimmune issues, and even mood issues such as bipolar disorder. There's a paper out there that talks about all this, and you guys can, I'll provide it in the chat after. But basically, fasting, when you fast for several days, your body seems to selectively get rid as well. I didn't discuss this one yet, but when you fast for several days, your body seems to get rid of autoimmune issues as well. And that's a very curious one. And so there's a lot of autoimmune issues out there. Some of them are skin conditions, right? I think psoriasis is an autoimmune issue. And also there's a very sinister, nasty autoimmune issue called MS, or multiple sclerosis. And it's basically when the body or the immune system attacks nerves in your body. It doesn't attack nerves, but it attacks something. Actually, let me show you the diagram. Let me just show you the diagram. Let me pull it up really quick. There, okay. So fasting seems to also help with multiple sclerosis. So there's a paper out there. So first, if you don't know what multiple sclerosis is, it's basically where someone is diagnosed with a severe autoimmune issue called multiple sclerosis. And it usually starts in their early 20s, or sometimes, if you're very unfortunate, your late teens. And no one really knows the true cause of it. All we know is that the immune system is attacking a bunch of fat insulation around your nerves. And so eventually a person is able to walk, but over time, they're not able to speak. They're not able to feed themselves. They're not able to use the bathroom properly themselves. And it's all because of this loss of neuronal function or brain function. And that is bad news. And so it's a really devastating disease. But it turns out that there was a trial done with the fasting mimicking diet, which I told you guys we would talk about towards the end. So the fasting mimicking diet, let me explain a little bit about that. The fasting mimicking diet is quite descriptive. It's basically where you trick your body into thinking that it's in a fasted state, where you're not, because if you guys remember that gene I was talking about called mTOR, it's activated by carbohydrates and proteins, right? So basically, if you don't put carbohydrates or proteins in your body, you won't activate that growth mode and also growth hormone. You won't activate that growth mode. And so you're tricking your body into thinking that it's not receiving enough nutrients. And so that's why we call it the fasting mimicking diet, because you can give it to cancer patients and they'll still get their nutrients like their vitamin A's and B's and all that, but they won't receive the nutrient active, or the pathway activation into growth mode. So that's what the fasting mimicking diet is. So it turns out if you put MS patients on this fasting mimicking diet, they're, after a couple of trials of this fasting mimicking diet, after a cycle or 2 or 3, their symptoms get better. And that is phenomenal. So basically, fasting reprograms the immune system and gets rid of autoimmune cells. And so over time, a lot of people that have, even in Upton Sinclair in 1911, he was describing people with skin issues that were autoimmune. And it turns out that fasting was reprogramming these people's immune systems. It's just that in the time in 1911, they didn't know that it was doing that. But now with modern science, we know that that's what's happening. We know that the sickly, nasty population of cells that is autoimmune and attacking your own body, such as in MS or type 1 diabetes, it is actually those cells are being slowly, I guess, thinned out of the population of immune cells. And so fasting is truly amazing. Anyway, so if you guys have questions, let me know in the chat. I know I tend to get a little bit lost in the kind of the boring scientific explanation of things. But yeah, let me know in the chat. I hope you guys enjoyed the talk, and I guess I'll be taking questions now. Okay, so first question is, does it matter what kind of fasting you are doing? How many hours? And the thing is, if you're relatively healthy, you're young, you don't need to be fasting extreme amounts like people with metabolic syndrome. So people, remember that trial that I showed you? Let me just go back. Remember that trial that I showed you where this trial where there were a bunch of obese people that were and also a healthy population that were put on a fasting diet. These people were put on a very strict fast of 5 days. So they would have to fast for 5 days, 5-day fasts, where they were eating basically nothing and just drinking water. And the thing is, they basically needed it because they were quite big and unhealthy. But I would say that for someone young and fit and all that, I don't think you need to go that extreme. And they were doing those 5-day fasts once every month, and even once every 2 months, because it is still quite an extreme stressor to put your body through. So are there foods that promote autophagy or slow it down, like with sugar, fat, and keto diet? Yeah, absolutely. So in the keto diet, you basically don't eat a lot of protein and a lot of carbohydrates. Your diet is basically fat, right? And as I said, you're not activating that nutrient sensing gene called mTOR. And so when you're not doing that, your body is in a heightened state of autophagy, I think. So another question, when we talk about fasting and its benefits, does it include avoiding drinking water as we do in Islamic fasting, or only avoiding food? So it's actually only avoiding food. So in Islamic fasting, which bears resemblance to the 16-8 fasting, where you fast for 16 hours of the day and eat for only 8 hours, you're basically, it's in 16-8, you're drinking water. But in Islamic fasting, you're avoiding water. I don't think there's that much difference in what's happening in that small time span where you're not eating, 15 hours in Kuwait, where you're not eating. I don't think there's that much difference if with water or without water. So, but yes, when we are talking about the health benefits of fasting, we're talking about it without water. Also, I should say that people in Kuwait fast for 15 hours a day, right? Or 15 hours in total. Whereas people in Greenland, Muslims in Greenland, fast for 20 hours, and they can only eat for 4 hours of the day. So that's pretty rough. Whereas other people in other countries have as little as 11 hours of fasting time. So lucky them. So I guess it helps kidney and adrenaline glands without water and maintain blood pressure. Huh. Could you elaborate on fasting's effect on mood disorders? Yeah, actually, it's one of the things that I didn't really get to explain because there's only so much you can include in a presentation that's supposed to be an hour long, and we're already almost at our hour limit. So it turns out that fasting also does something to the gut. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard also on tons of Instagram health pages and stuff that our guts have a big population of bacteria, right? And those bacteria are kind of in a crosstalk with our brain, where they reside in the gut and they have intimate access to our central nervous system through our spinal cord. And you would think that that's not the case, but it actually is. Certain bacteria in your gut produce serotonin, they produce dopamine, they produce all sorts of stuff. And those chemicals are making it from your gut into your central nervous system and making it up to your brain. And so when you fast, you're reducing, especially for a prolonged period of time, you're basically reducing the bacterial population in your gut. And because they don't have any food either, right? If you don't have any food, they don't have any food. So what are they going to produce all those nice, happy chemicals for? So we're not exactly sure, especially in mood disorders, because a lot of that is kind of uncharted territory because it's so complex. We're not exactly sure how does fasting translate or rebalance or improve the mood, but we just know that it does improve the mood. We're not sure about the mechanism of how, but we do think that it has something to do with the gut. So what does fasting do to a decribrated person? I'm not sure what you said, Fawad. I'm not sure what you're asking. And Bedr, I hope I answered your question satisfactorily. If I didn't, then message me a little bit more. I'm a little confused. Why do dietitians say that we shouldn't fast or starve ourselves? Because it slows down our metabolism when science proved otherwise. It's a good question. So I think what dietitians are talking about is getting your body used to dealing with lower calories, right? So anytime you do like something like a crash diet where you're restricting yourself severely, you're basically training your body to deal with or to function with less calories, right? And so you're basically telling your muscles and your fat and all your tissues to become more energetically efficient, number one. A lot of people tend to feel cold, right, when they're on a diet because, their body's not exactly dealing with a lot of energy. It doesn't have access to a lot of energy, so it can't produce a lot of heat, right? So starving yourself or slowly reducing, not starving yourself like fasting, but reducing your food intake in a typical diet does slow down your metabolism. And it's because as I said, you're training your body to basically deal with less calories. Whereas if you worked out and you had more muscle mass, you're increasing your metabolism. So that's why one of the best ways to lose weight is not running per se, it's actually building muscle, because you're making more metabolically expensive tissue that will burn a bunch of fat even when you're sleeping. So I hope that answered the question. On a similar note, how do you try to incorporate fasting in your routine when you regularly work out, but also don't want to lose weight? How do you incorporate fasting? Okay, so you don't want to lose weight. Okay, so I would say keep your calories the same. So whatever window where I'm assuming you're talking about in intermittent fasting as opposed to prolonged fasting, right? So intermittent fasting, you have a window of time to basically eat. In that time, you want to keep so let's say right now you're eating 1,500 calories or 2,000 calories a day. You want to have all those calories in that window. And that's how you don't lose weight. Because what's interesting about fasting, though, is that a lot of the hardcore calories in, calories out nutritionists out there, they say that they don't know actually that with fasting, it's not as simple as calories in, calories out. You're telling your body, basically what we're seeing with people that do fast is that they're basically, how do I say this? They're basically losing weight. Let's say I take two populations, right? One population of people, they're just eating regularly and they're reducing their calories, right? They have a maintenance of or they have a deficit, let's say, of calories, right? And I put the same, I guess, actually, you know what? No, sorry. Let's say I take one population, I give them 2,000 calories a day, and that is their maintenance requirement, 2,000 calories a day. And then I take another population, I put them on 2,000 calories a day. But I also put them on a fasting protocol. Turns out the fasted people that are having 2,000 calories a day, they'll actually have more lean muscle mass and less body fat over time than the people that are just having 2,000 calories a day and not time restricted or not fasting. And that is something very interesting, and that the calories in, calories out people have to kind of consider. it's not as simple as that. It's that fasting is activating other molecular pathways that are helping us, I guess, reduce our weights. And something to think about is in the same vein as fasting is something called time-restricted eating, right? Where you're only eating in the daytime and not at night. And it turns out humans are very routine. We're built like a precision Swiss watch, where you can eat or you'll be sort of insulin sensitive for 12 hours, meaning you can put sugar in your body and your body will take it up and into the cells or into your body. You could take in that sugar for those 12 hours. But after those 12 hours, it's funny, your body doesn't want to take in that sugar. Your body becomes insulin insensitive later past that 12 or 9 hour window for some people. And so basically that's one of the reasons why people, a lot of the time they say don't eat at night, is because you've already passed your kind of diurnal circadian insulin rhythm, right? So we know that there's a rhythm with melatonin and all that stuff, but also it turns out there's a rhythm or there's a rhythmicity to your insulin sensitivity. And that's one of the reasons that maybe we're seeing that effect that I was describing, where the people that are eating 2000 calories and not fasting are just kind of maintaining their weight, and they're not really, I'm not sure, to be honest, but I hope that helped. But basically try to get, if you're incorporating fasting in your routine, try to get the same amount of calories if you want to maintain your weight. But I will say that you might lose a lot, maybe a little bit more fat mass and gain a little bit more muscle mass. Does hibernation have similar benefits of fasting? Well, we're humans, we don't hibernate, but so I don't know if I can answer that. I don't know if there's studies on bears or other animals that hibernate. I'm not sure. I don't think so, because I think it's a different kind of, you're telling your body to do something totally different, which is conserve energy rather than survive in an energy deficit. You're telling your body to just sleep in an energy deficit, or just be inactive in an energy deficit. Whereas for us, we don't have the luxury of hibernating, so it's a very different condition. So I'm not sure how to answer that. So I hope I was informative, guys. So just to summarize, we talked about metabolic disease, we talked about Alzheimer's, we talked about multiple sclerosis briefly. We talked about cancer. And so I hope this has inspired you to finish Ramadan strong, and also to continue fasting even outside of the holy month. And I hope you spread the message and, read more about it in your own time. So guys, I hope it was informative, and have a lovely night. I'll be around for another minute for more questions if you guys have any other questions. If you have, if you're curious about any of the content, feel free to email me at my email address right here. It's for work. It's in the chat. All right, guys. And thank you for coming. You're welcome, Noor. All right, guys. Have a good night.